All right, there we go. So chapter 22 here gets into Darwin's ideas and how they relate to actual things that we see in nature, okay? And how what he observed can help explain what has happened over time. So we'll start very simply with a view of what Darwin understood. There's a lot to know in here, so make sure we look at those objectives. But Darwin was influenced by certain people, okay? Like a lot of scientists, Darwin started as being influenced by a person, a couple geologists named Hutton and Lyell, which is odd because they're not biologists. They're not really chemists. They are chemists in a certain way, but they are geologists. They deal with rocks and they deal with the earth and layers of the earth and things of that nature. And they had this idea, and it turns out it's kind of right, of gradualism. Gradualism is where you have profound change that can take place through cumulative effects of slow and continuous processes. So their ideas would have described what happened in the Grand Canyon, the fact that over the course of time, maybe this erosion from a river that runs through a particular part of the world can wear away a bunch of the rock, and then it makes this giant canyon, this giant valley, okay? The fact that the Smoky Mountains are not as high as the Rockies because of gradual erosion over time. They're older than the Rockies, so they've had more time to wear down. That idea, those ideas are some of the things that Darwin looked at and said, yeah, I think maybe I can apply that to living organisms, that there is gradual change over time, and that change is really, really slow and very, very small, okay? And so that's part of his idea. Another guy he looked at was Lamarck, and you guys may have heard of Lamarck. I don't know how deep Bio 1 gets into this stuff, and I thought at some point Mr. Swanson talked about Lamarck. But Lamarck hypothesized that species evolve through use and disuse, and also the inheritance of some of these traits, the use and disuse of traits, and also the inheritance of those traits. And so even though Lamarck ended up being wrong, okay, so Lamarck's theory basically says this. You see the pictures of a giraffe here. That let's say a giraffe, over the course of its life, and maybe it started out, maybe an early ancestor to the giraffe started out with a relatively short neck. And let's say it wanted to get to these leaves up at a higher part of the tree. And it stretched its neck, and the muscles in its neck stretched just a little bit. And it was able to get those things, okay? And so since this little giraffe with its shorter neck stretched just a little bit to get to those higher branches, the extra stretching of its neck muscles was able to be transmitted or inherited by his children or her children, okay? These are the ideas of Lamarck, and that over time, this constant stretching of the neck by each generation added up because of constant use. And by the time we look at the giraffe now, it's got this giant neck, okay? That was Lamarck's idea. Turns out Lamarck was dead wrong. That's not how it works. I mean, just think about how that would work with us. Let's say I take steroids and get jacked, just straight, and I can break this table in half, right? And then I scream at everybody because I'm on constant roid rage. So just pretend that I'm doing that, and I got the veins popping and whatever else. Am I going to be able to pass this jacked muscles on to my kids because I took steroids? No. In fact, I'd probably have a less chance of having kids based on what we know steroids does to you. But that's akin to what we see here. It just doesn't happen that way. But the idea that these traits can be passed on to the next generation is kind of what Darwin stole from Lamarck. Lamarck had this good idea of these traits being passed on, but he talked about them being passed on in a different way. Now, the next picture is there to illustrate as well. I don't know how many people garden, or maybe somebody actually does bonsai trees. I don't know. But bonsai trees, if you know what a bonsai tree is, it's an art form, okay, that has people basically planting a seed of a tree and then grooming it and cutting it so that it looks like a miniature tree. And it looks like a full-size tree, like it's got the branches and the thick trunk and everything else, but it's much smaller, obviously, right? So people who do bonsai actually grow normal trees. This is a normal tree. If we just threw that seed in the ground that made this thing and just let it grow, it would grow into a tree that's 50 feet tall. But what they do is they train this tree to only grow in a certain way. If we took a seed, plucked the seed right off of this tree here and planted it, it would grow into a 50-foot pine tree. Okay? So this is another illustration of Lamarck just being wrong. Okay? This tree right here was trained to do this. The same way if I took steroids and trained my muscles to get big, they would get big, but I would not pass that on to my child. Okay? This tree is not going to pass the fact that it's been trained to grow small onto its children. The same way that even if that giraffe did stretch its neck muscles just a little bit, it's not going to be able to pass that on to the next generation. But those ideas stuck in Darwin's head, and he came up with these new kind of revolutionary, groundbreaking ideas. And I say revolutionary and groundbreaking because at the time it was. Okay, and I always like to at least cover this or talk about it. It says, as the 19th century dawned, it was generally believed that species had remained unchanged since their creation. One of the things that Darwin had to deal with was the church at this point in time. The view that God had created everything at the time exactly how I wanted it. And what Darwin was talking about went completely over top of that. Totally just said, nope, that's not right. The Bible's wrong. And you can imagine what early 19th century folks would have thought about that. You're talking highly religious people, okay? The point where the church is extremely powerful, right? And even to this day, and I like to at least be upfront with people and let you know where I stand on these types of things. I generally try to, I know there's some teachers who are going to be upfront and vocal about what kind of politics they believe in and what kind of social issues they latch onto. I've been trained as a teacher where I went to school to not do that, okay? But I think with issues like this that can be relatively controversial, you should at least know a little bit about this part and me. 95% of you are going to care less, okay? But I still feel a little bit obligated to say that I go to church regularly, okay? I go to Bible study every Sunday. I consider myself a faithful person. And that's my right? And as is everybody else's to believe what you want to believe. And as a biology teacher, somebody who studied biology for, my entire teaching career, plus the 4 or 5 years I went to U of I find this to be the most challenging part of my faith. Because I know that the book that I read, the Bible that I read says one thing about it, and the stuff that I know from learning says another thing. And to me, that's part of the journey. Okay, part of the journey is, it's my part, to be honest with you, to figure out where they mesh, if they do mesh at all. And which side am I going to kind of be more heavily leaning? Okay, is there a way that you can make them both mesh? I don't know. But for me, what I do is I internalize that and I think about it. These are literally things that I think about when I go to bed. Or I'm driving to school. I try to figure out where these two mesh, if they do, how I can find room for both. But what I want to make sure that I let you know is that on a relatively controversial, especially now since, it seems like the nation's getting polarized to extremes, right? That I'm going to tell you what I know about this topic, okay? And I'm not going to try to put my religious spin on it. Okay, I'm just going to show you evidence. I'm going to show you things that science has looked at. I'm going to show you things that scientists say, and then it's your job to figure out where it meshes with what you believe. Okay, and so I like to give that little spiel before we go diving into all this stuff. And regardless of what you believe, it is interesting, the stuff that we look at and think about. And I like to look at things from different perspectives at the very least. So that's that. Now on to the stuff that will be needed for an AP test, right? Let's talk about Darwin and his adventure. Really, it is kind of an adventure because we could skip this, but I like to at least touch on the fact that Darwin went someplace that not many people have ever been before, and he saw crazy, crazy things. He went to the Galapagos Islands, and we all know a little bit about his trip on the Beagle. That's the name of his ship. He went to the Galapagos Islands, and they are an isolated chain of islands off of Africa somewhere out in the middle of the ocean. And they're so isolated that they have just crazy looking species that aren't seen anywhere else. So he observed adaptations and behaviors in plants and animals that inhabited many diverse environments. And that's one thing that the Galapagos does have. They've got many, many different diverse environments. And he would have seen things like this. Okay, this is an iguana. It's not like the iguanas that you get like pets. These are kind of like rock iguanas. They're Galapagos iguanas. They look different than the ones you can have from the pet store. They look like, to be honest with you, they look like Godzilla. They look prehistoric, okay? And, these things aren't around in many other parts of the world. And so he goes to this island, sees all this crazy stuff that he's never seen before, and frankly, many people have not seen before. Right? Not only does he look at physical adaptations, but he looks at behaviors of some of these animals as well. He sees strange behaviors that doesn't see anywhere else. And so what I've done is I've compiled a few of these behaviors. And this is what we'll watch. Okay, it's a couple of 3-4 minute videos of different behaviors of birds that are found on the Galapagos Islands. And as Darwin looked through and saw these, oh man, I was way off. It was out off the coast of South America. I said Africa. I was thinking of Madagascar. Okay, so Galapagos Islands are off in South America. But anyway, we will watch these videos. They're entertaining. You guys will, I think, really like these ones because they're off the wall. All right, folks at home, I'm going to try to do this as well so that you can see it, but I have to not share the screen. All right. So the first one I think we'll look at is look at the blue-footed boobies. This is their courtship ritual.
On the Galapagos Islands, blue-footed boobies are just starting their families. Blue-footed boobies also dance to form partnerships. Each movement mirrors the other. Like flamingos, they seem to fall for birds like themselves. Compatible. Booby means clown. Their big blue feet are an important part of the costume. Blue feet are important because the blue color is hard to make, especially if the birds are in poor condition. It's an honest indicator of good health. So, they show them off. Unlike flamingos, boobies continue their courtship displays even after nesting starts, as though they weren't quite sure of each other. And then, while their partners are away feeding, both sexes flirt with their neighbors. The truth is that boobies have a roving eye, and those blue feet tend to wander. About half have secret extramarital affairs. They come up to each other and display. and one thing leads to another. Occasionally, the male comes back and sees the female with someone else. She quickly returns to his side. He doesn't react. They display, as they always do, in their relationship. They never split up. It seems here the instinct to stay together to raise a family is stronger than any infidelity.
Okay, so that one, you kind of see the weird dance thing that they have. Even the feet, the color of the feet is important. It displays what we'll learn to be called fitness, how fit they are, how good they are for their environment, how healthy they are. And so that is all part of the environment as well. I think he mentioned that certain foods that they eat from the environment allow them to make the blue color. And so one of the things Darwin eventually kind of understands or realizes that it's the environment that does play a large role on why some of these animals ultimately look the way that they do. Let's look at the albatross courtship ritual. This one's fun as well.
These powerful bills are quite strong enough to injure anything or anyone that dares to interfere with the birds. But now, as the pair sit together on their nest site, they're used to deliver the most tender of caresses. What follows may seem like dueling, but actually it is, once again, a kind of dancing. The sequence of movements is long and complicated. If both partners perform without mistakes and in harmony, then at last there comes the most intimate act of all.
So Sir David Attenborough here gets a little bit creepy in the next part. So it's kind of funny, so I'll just make you aware of it.
Mating in birds can be a very quick business, no more than a brief meeting of genital openings. In albatross, it's unusually leisurely. So, pairs are formed and the union is consummated. For most birds, the pair will now stay together for several weeks, if not for several years. In the case of these waved albatross in Galapagos, they'll stay together for the rest of their lives. And that, when you come to think of it, is very unusual. Insects don't stay together, frogs and toads don't, lizards and snakes don't. Why should birds? The answer is there. No female bird can manage to fly around with an egg inside her, let alone several, for the days or weeks it needs to develop. As soon as she can, she...
All right, so that one's fun, but this one's even more fun. This is just, the next one's just kind of silly. More than anything, these are fun albatross. Oh! No, it's somebody else took it down. Or is this a Unit 5 deal? Because of the what? Let me see if I can find it. It's so fun. Let me see. Hold on. Folks at home. It's the greatest.
Yes.
This one here. Is this it? Oh, that makes me mad. Okay. I'll see if I can find it again. I don't know. The people who did it might have just taken it down. That might be what happened. But oh man. Okay. Anyways, I'll go ahead and start the sharing back here. All right. So if I can find that video, we'll watch it, or I'll share it or something like that. We'll watch it during class. But the idea there is that he saw weird stuff. Okay, that's really the gist of it. And he kind of thought of these things as what he called adaptations, right? Things that were meant to do a certain job in the environment that they were found. Okay, and so those mating dances were technically adaptations. Those birds had developed that mating dance for a certain reason. They had developed the ability to turn their feet and beaks blue for a certain reason. Those are adaptations. And he perceived adaptation to the environment and the origin of brand new species to be completely linked, very closely related. So that's what he centered his studies on. And when one of the things that he looked at came about, the finches is probably the most famous part of his excursion, because they provided some useful evidence to support this idea of the adaptations he saw in certain animals being closely linked to the environment and thus being closely linked to the origin of brand new species, which is really what he was trying to gather, trying to understand is how we saw this rich diversity of life in the world with all these different adaptations that seem to line up with the environment and being able to help that animal survive in a certain environment. So what he looked at here and was kind of the basis of his data and his discovery, if you want to call it that, were these finches. And you've all heard of the Galapagos finches of Darwin. And what he looked at there were the different beak types, the different beak sizes of these animals. And these are obviously all animals that are closely related. You can just tell by the look on their body and their feathers and their facial structure and things of that nature. But one of the things that you'll notice is that their beaks are all kind of different size, different shapes. And it turns out that those different beak sizes and beak shapes are good at allowing them to get or eat certain types of food. And certain types of food were prominent on certain parts of the island where certain finches were found. So it is this idea of the environment dictating what these animals look like over time. Okay, so this guy right here has a certain shaped beak for cactus eating. Its primary food source was cacti, and it had a long, very, very sharp beak that would be good for chopping up pieces of cacti. You know, if you garden at home, you probably, or your parents do, they probably have a pair of garden shears or pruning snips. They're very sharp, and they allow you to cut through plant matter very, very easily. And it's probably exactly what this beak shape allowed for that guy to do. This one here has a very, very robust beak, a very strong beak, a very thick beak. And this one could be compared to like a set of pliers, okay? The seed eater kind of got its food from the ground. It would eat seeds. And I eat sunflower seeds like crazy. Does anybody else like eat? I know sometimes baseball. Are you a sunflower seed eater? During baseball season? I eat sunflower seeds like crazy. I go through bags and bags a week. But You can't eat the outside part of a sunflower seed. Try it. You'll break your teeth and then you'll tear up your stomach. It's something to break open that seed. You got to break it open and get to the nut inside, the sunflower nut inside, and that's what they have to do. And so those seed coats are really, really hard. They got to crack them open using that thick, strong beak, and then get to the stuff that's actually good on the inside. Peanuts are the same way. And then this guy down here eats insects. And you notice the size of his beak, very, very small, petites, okay? It's very quick. You can open it very quick, close it very quick. It can get into small spots that these insects like to hide. And it's perfect for catching insects where these other two might not be, okay? So we look at the beak shape of these animals, and we notice that the beak shape changes wildly throughout different parts of the island. And so this led Darwin to observe certain things, okay? Darwin developed two big ideas that evolution explains life's unity and diversity. In other words, evolution described why he saw such a, hold on, let me go back one slide. Why evolution created this diversity. If it creates this diversity in finch beaks, why couldn't it create the diversity we see on Earth? Okay. Incidentally, evolution is a word that means change over time. Okay. That's all evolution means. It describes a change over time. So he tried to describe a mechanism for this change over time. And this is where he kind of got in trouble with the clergy, with the religious folks. He also described this idea of natural selection. Okay? Natural selection is the cause of evolution, is the cause of this change over time. Okay? And that's what we're going to spend time talking about, is this idea of natural selection and how it works. What are some of the things that he observed? What are some of the things that he looked at and saw on his trips to the Galapagos that allowed him to understand what natural selection was and how it drove evolution, how it drove these changes in species over time? Okay? Darwin's theory can be broken down into 5 observations and 3 inferences. I just love this picture. Evolution sometimes sucks. You go from a dinosaur to a little kiwi bird. Isn't that fun? That's what scientists think happened to the dinosaurs, kind of, is that they ultimately kind of evolved into birds, at least some species. But anyway, that's what we're going to get into here, starting off. And this is really the foundational points of natural selection. The 5 observations that we're going to look at. These are the things that he saw, okay, in his studies on the Galapagos Islands, and then what he inferred that those observations meant for natural selection, for evolution, for change over time. Okay. And then we'll take some time and we'll kind of break it down and we'll kind of summarize natural selection as a whole. But I want to talk about his observations and his inferences at least first. Okay. Observation 1. In his studies in the Galapagos, he found that for any species that he saw, population sizes would increase exponentially if all individuals that are born reproduce sexually or successfully and sexually. That if all individuals that were born reproduce successfully, the population size would increase exponentially. So and that makes sense, because what we see in the human population is just that. Most of the people who are born reproduce successfully. Our population has grown exponentially over the course of the past 200 years, 300 years, whatever it's been. Okay? So he saw that that's something that would play out in the natural world if they were all able to reproduce. Observation 2, populations tend to be stable in size except for seasonal fluctuations. So what he's noticed is that in observation 1, if all of those animals were able to reproduce, there would be exponential growth. But then he goes back in observation 2 and says, but that's not really what happens. I don't see that. There's not exponential growth in these animals all the time. Okay? And observation 3, resources are limited. Okay, so this led him to this idea that production of more individuals that the environment can support leads to a struggle for existence among individuals of a population with only a fraction of their offspring surviving. So those first three observations, that if the animals were left unchecked and could all reproduce, we'd have exponential growth. He noticed doesn't actually happen in observation 2, and that there's also limited resources, which means there's some kind of struggle for survival, kind of. Production of more individuals than environments can support leads to a struggle for existence. There's not enough of this stuff to go around in observation 3. So that's why observation 2 is true. That's why there are stable populations of these things, because some things just die because they don't have enough to eat. And so this idea of the struggle for existence is so important. That is really one of the foundational pieces of natural selection, survival of the fittest, right? So out of this inference, take that away from it, that there is a struggle for survival because there are limited resources in populations that want to grow exponentially. That creates a struggle for existence. All right. Next set of observations. Observations 4 and 5 lead to the next two inferences. Observation 4, members of a population vary extensively in their characteristics. In other words, no two individuals are alike. Even identical twins in a human population are not 100% alike. Yes, we've talked about this already. Yes, most of their DNA is the same, but there are small variations in their DNA because of epigenetics. We notice that just in the way that they develop over time. And even you get a population like this. Each one of these little ladybug-looking creatures, I don't think they are ladybugs, but each one of these little ladybug creatures looks the same, but they vary differently. They vary extensively, I should say, from one to another. And how do you know? It's their dots. Their dots are kind of like tiger stripes or fingerprints. Each dot looks the same, but it's not. It's distinctly different. Okay, it might be placed just a little bit different. It might be irregular in another way than the person right next to it, or the bug right next to it. So members of a population vary extensively, and that much of this variation is heritable. So those are two things that kind of go together, led to these two ideas here. Survival depends in part on inherited traits. Individuals whose inherited traits give them a high probability of surviving and reproducing are likely to leave more offspring than other individuals. Okay, so this links to that struggles for survival a little bit. The ones that have certain inherited characteristics, okay, survival depends on certain inherited traits, are going to have a higher probability of surviving, and if they survive better, they get to reproduce. So that's another one of those foundational pieces of natural selection. Individuals who have better traits for a certain situation are going to survive at a higher rate, and if they do, they get to reproduce. That's their reward. Hey, you're really good at surviving, you get to make a baby. There you go. That's your present for life. And so that's the goal of most of these creatures. A lot of these creatures that we call lower order life forms or whatever, is that they want to pass on their genes to the next generation. And so they do anything that they can. They try to display that they have the best inherited characteristics as a result. Okay? So certain traits are beneficial in certain situations. All right, last inference. Last inference here, this unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to gradual changes in a population, with favorable characteristics accumulating over generations, which is why we see in some animals characteristics that kind of look the same or are more extreme, because those are the ones that were better suited to live in their environment. And so if they're better suited to live, they get the opportunity to pass their good traits on to the next generation. And if they get to do that, more of that generation is going to have that trait, right? I even think we see this now in human population, to be honest with you. I really do. I mean, people, if you follow sports, it's seen really pretty prominently in sports. Back in even the mid 80s, 1985, when the Bears drafted a player called William Perry. They called him the Fridge. He was revolutionary in 1985 because he was over 300 pounds. Like, he was the only guy in the NFL that weighed 300 pounds. You know how many people weigh 300 pounds in the NFL right now who's a lineman? Like, all of them. And so I see people getting bigger, faster, and stronger as a result. And I think there's something there. I think that that we are evolving even within a 20-year period to be bigger, faster, stronger type of thing. I think you see it in athletes all the time. But that's what inference 3 kind of talks about here, is that when you have a favorable characteristic that allows for survival, you get to pass that on to the next generation. And if it helps them survive, they get to pass it on to the next generation. And then you have a large population that is that all has this kind of similar trait, this really good trait for survival. We do see this in the peppered moss. You guys have probably seen the peppered moss, and I think that's where we'll pick up as kind of a review when we come back next week. We'll play around with the peppered moss and kind of review a little bit and then go from there. All right, so folks at home, you guys are free to leave. I'm going to put the recording up sometime this afternoon.